When a government cuts a hostile nation off from the global financial system, it is presented as a clean, bloodless alternative to military conflict. We are told that economic sanctions isolate the aggressor, freeze their capabilities, and protect the rules-based international order without firing a single shot. But this narrative contains a profound, systemic miscalculation. In a hyper-connected global economy, economic weapons do not operate like sniper rifles. They operate like financial radiation. The targeted nation feels the initial impact, but the fallout mutates through global supply chains, destabilizes innocent neutral states, and actively degrades the very architecture that made the weapon powerful in the first place. The uncomfortable truth of modern geopolitics is that the true cost of an economic war is rarely paid by the country being punished. It is absorbed by the rest of the world. For nearly a century, the global trading system has operated on a foundational premise: maximum efficiency through integration. Companies do not source components from local suppliers. They build sprawling cross-border networks to chase fractions of a percent in cost savings. Semiconductors designed in one hemisphere are packaged in another and assembled in a third. This system exists because open trade lowers production costs, suppresses inflation, and raises living standards globally. It relies entirely on a predictable, neutral framework of international banking and maritime trade routes. But when major economic powers weaponize this framework, they transform commercial infrastructure into geopolitical choke points. The primary objective shifts from economic optimization to national security, forcing a fundamental rewiring of how goods and money move across the planet. To understand how this system became so easily weaponized, we must look to the aftermath of the Second World War. When the Bretton Woods Agreement established the United States dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, it was meant to stabilize global commerce. Over the decades, this gave the Western financial architecture, specifically the SWIFT messaging network based in Europe, a practical monopoly over international transactions. The system was highly efficient, but it created an immense concentration of structural power. For decades, the enforcement of international norms relied on the assumption that no rational state would risk being disconnected from this matrix. However, as geopolitical friction escalated over the last decade, Western policymakers began deploying financial exclusion not as a temporary deterrent, but as a permanent weapon of choice. This created an immediate, powerful counter-incentive for any nation outside the immediate Western alliance to rethink its vulnerabilities. The actual mechanism of a modern sanctions war relies on an invisible web of financial leverage known as secondary sanctions. When a primary sanction bans companies from trading with a targeted regime, secondary sanctions take the concept a step further. They dictate that any foreign bank or corporation doing business with the targeted state will lose access to the entire Western financial market. Because the US dollar is on one side of nearly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, losing access to dollar clearing is a corporate death sentence. Consequently, a bank in Asia, Africa, or Latin America will immediately cut ties with a sanctioned entity, even if their own government opposes the restriction. This mechanism effectively forces the entire corporate world to enforce the foreign policy of a single capital, policing international trade through private compliance departments. The consequences of this mechanism, however, trigger severe economic distortions that ripple outward unpredictably. The most immediate casualty is supply chain fragmentation. When major suppliers of industrial metals, fertilizers, or agricultural goods are abruptly ring-fenced, global corporations cannot simply find instantaneous replacements. They face severe production bottlenecks and are forced to relocate operations to politically aligned nations, a process known as friendshoring. This relocation requires massive capital expenditure, which inherently increases production costs. In a deeply globalized market, these escalating costs translate directly into persistent, systemic inflation across the globe. Simultaneously, the senders of these economic weapons frequently absorb severe collateral damage through counter-sanctions and energy shocks. When a major energy exporter's output is restricted or artificially capped, global fuel and food prices surge. This dynamic creates a harsh divergence between economic winners and losers. While multinational energy conglomerates may reap temporary windfall profits from higher commodity prices, ordinary people worldwide face a direct assault on their purchasing power. For developing economies with high dependencies on imported fuel and grain, these Western-driven financial blockades create catastrophic, uncompensated costs, despite these nations bearing absolutely no responsibility for the underlying geopolitical conflicts. This reality highlights the fundamental misunderstanding surrounding the efficacy of economic blockades. The prevailing narrative suggests that cutting an economy off from the world will cause its internal systems to collapse, forcing a political surrender. This narrative fails because it treats national economies as static structures. In reality, complex economies are adaptive systems. When isolated, a targeted state does not simply cease trading. It reorients its commerce, establishes illicit smuggling pipelines, and offers its resources at steep discounts to opportunistic buyers. The trade does not disappear. It merely shifts into the shadows, making the sanctions highly symbolic, while eroding the transparency of the global trading system. This adaptation process is currently driving the long-term degradation of the Western financial monopoly through de-dollarization. Witnessing the absolute freezing of central bank assets and mass expulsions from the SWIFT network, non-aligned emerging economies have recognized that relying exclusively on the US dollar introduces an existential vulnerability to their own sovereignty. To mitigate this risk, nations are actively constructing parallel, alternative payment networks. Bilateral trade is increasingly invoiced in local currencies, rather than converting through the dollar. Central banks are systematically reducing their holdings of Western government debt, choosing instead to stockpile physical gold, which cannot be frozen or seized by a foreign power. The first scenario is the formalization of a fragmented, multipolar financial system. For this to occur, alternative clearing networks, such as China's cross-border interbank payment system or regional local currency settlement mechanisms, must achieve full technological interoperability. This would split global commerce into distinct financial blocks, rendering traditional Western sanctions largely ineffective against states operating within the alternative sphere. The second scenario is an escalating geoeconomic friction characterized by systemic secondary compliance wars. This outcome requires Western jurisdictions to aggressively punish neutral nations that utilize these parallel networks. Such a dynamic would force a hard choice upon mid-sized economies, accelerating the decoupling of global manufacturing and entrenching long-term stagflation as international trade becomes permanently less efficient. The final scenario is a pragmatic stabilization, where the hypercomplexity and severe collateral damage of total economic warfare force a return to targeted, multilateral diplomacy. This scenario depends on major powers recognizing that the unrestricted deployment of financial weapons yields diminishing returns, while imposing unsustainable costs on the global consumer base, ultimately threatening their own domestic economic stability. Economic weapons were designed under the assumption that the global financial system was a permanent, unassailable utility, owned and regulated by the West. But a system built on trust cannot easily survive its own weaponization. Every time a transaction is blocked, an asset is frozen, or a supply chain is severed, the economic incentives that hold the global order together begin to fracture. The true cost of a sanctions war is not measured solely by the GDP contraction of a targeted regime or the corporate losses of a domestic industry. It is measured by the steady, irreversible dismantling of the integrated world economy. If the global financial architecture is systematically converted into an arena for geopolitical warfare, we must ask an uncomfortable question. When the system finally breaks completely, who will bear the cost of rebuilding it?